Okay, Lauren, I think you can begin.
Oh, am I missing messages? Is that's what's
Yes,
telling me?
go ahead.
Sorry. Sorry, everyone. Just amazing coordination though. Very seamless and incredible. So hello, everyone. And thank you to Melissa for making all the magic happen to bring us here. So hello and welcome to today's panel called Climate Mobility Justice, Reimagining Responsibility, Knowledge and Belonging in a Warming World. I am Lauren Grant, founding executive director of Beyond Climate Collaborative, and I am delighted to be moderating today's discussion, hosted as part of the virtual symposium on climate-driven migration, organized by Western Michigan University's Climate Change Working Group, the Global Center for Climate Mobility, and the Platform on Disaster Displacement. Before we dive in, I want to take a moment to thank the organizers for putting together this very timely symposium with such an excellent lineup. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to attend some of the other sessions, but I know there've been a lot of really impactful conversations happening this week, which is really great to see. I also want to thank all of you for joining, for taking the time to be here, and of course to our panelists for sharing their time, expertise, and reflections with us today. So I have the lovely task of offering a bit of framing for our conversation before introducing our amazing panelists. And while I do so, if we can see it, I think we can. I would like to encourage all of you to introduce yourselves in the chat. It's always nice to know who is coming and participating in these conversations. So here I go, diving in. I just want to start by saying that we are gathering in a moment when climate change is certainly no longer a distant concern, but is reshaping lives and landscapes and communities around the world. This brings essential questions, which are often very uncomfortable, about who moves when the climate changes, who is left behind, who decides, and based on what criteria or factors. And bigger questions like what kinds of futures are we enabling through the frameworks by which we understand climate mobility and respond to it today. Too often, discussions about climate mobility focus only on immediate humanitarian or technical needs, evacuation plans, relocation schemes, emergency funding. While important, of course, these responses don't tell the whole story. Mobility, whether migration, displacement, planned relocation, or the choice and necessity to stay, which is often referred to as immobility, is a matter of justice, ethics, and collective responsibility. It reflects historical inequities, power dynamics, and questions of knowledge, authority, and belonging. Climate mobility justice, therefore, asks us to shift our perspectives. It encourages us to consider not just how people move, but why they move or don't move. It asks us to interrogate the systems, structures, and institutions shaping these choices and to imagine policies, practices, and solidarities that are fair, inclusive, and rooted in the needs of those most affected. It also asks us to grapple with knowledge itself. Who is recognized as an expert? Whose experiences and insights shape decisions? Decolonial and feminist approaches, on the other hand, remind us that expertise is not only institutional, it emerges from communities, lived experiences, indigenous and local knowledges, and the ways that people adapt, resist, and care for their communities, homes, and futures. Finally, climate mobility justice is about belonging. Movement is not the only marker of vulnerability or resilience. Sometimes staying, holding onto one's land, heritage, and community is an act of courage and agency. Sometimes defending the right to remain is the most crucial form of justice. This conversation today invites us to look beyond policy categories and crisis frames, to ask deeper questions about who moves, who doesn't, who decides, and what kinds of futures are enabled or foreclosed through our current responses to climate change and mobility. Rather than treating mobility as only a humanitarian or technical challenge, today we'll explore it as a site of justice, decolonization, and transformation. So with this framing in mind, I'm thrilled to introduce our incredible panelists who bring diverse perspectives from scholarly research to grassroots organizing, local community leadership to transnational policy advocacy. They will help us explore these questions in depth and guide our conversation toward imagining what climate mobility justice can look like in practice. So with this, I would like to start by introducing Dr. Mimi Scheller, who's really become a friend, if I can say so. So I'm very happy and honored to have you here, Mimi.
Thank
Dr.
you.
Mimi Scheller is the inaugural, if I can add a formal introduction here, is the inaugural dean of the Global School at Worcester Polytech Institute. She co-founded the Center for Mobilities Research at Lancaster University and later led the sociology department at Drexel University. Dr. Scheller is a pioneering scholar in mobility justice, exploring the political and ethical dimensions of movement and immobility. Her research bridges mobility studies, Caribbean studies, and post-colonial theory, shaping how we understand climate, migration, and responsibility today. Before I hand over to you, I'm just going to do a quick round and introduce everyone so we can get the fun introductions out of the way. So I'll then introduce Nida Zero, who I am so blessed to get to work with every day, who is lead knowledge specialist at Beyond Climate Collaborative and PhD candidate at the London School of Economics. Nida examines how dominant knowledge systems shape who is heard in climate and migration spaces. Using a decolonial and feminist lens, she explores community-led participatory approaches to climate mobility and immobility justice, rooted in sovereignty, memory, and place. And last but not least, Dr. Lily Yumagulova is Program Director of Preparing Our Home, supporting Indigenous youth and communities in disaster resilience and climate adaptation. With over 20 years of experience in government, NGOs, and Indigenous governance, Dr. Yumaglova bridges knowledge systems across generations, centering local leadership, the right to say, and community agency in climate resilience. For those who are looking at the flyer promoting this event, unfortunately, Benjamin Nagaru cannot be here with us today due to a storm just outside of Nairobi where he sits. So unfortunately, we'll have to have the conversation without him, but I think we have a pretty good lineup in any case. So with our panelists introduced, I would now like to dive into this discussion. You're probably sick of hearing me talk, so let's do it. So with this, I just also will add that we will conclude today's event with a Q&A. So you're most welcome to share questions in the chat during the session, and we'll get to them at the end. So I'd like to start with this big picture of introducing climate mobility justice as a framework, which is no small task, but I think we are joined by the perfect person to do it, really. So Dr. Scheller, your work on mobility justice has been absolutely foundational in helping us to see movement and immobility not simply as logistical or humanitarian issues, but as deeply political and ethical ones. So as we begin this conversation, I'd like to ask, how does the framework of climate mobility justice help us to move beyond crisis management toward questions of responsibility, belonging, and repair? And what shifts, conceptual or institutional, does it demand from the ways we currently respond to climate-related displacement? And I think if I can just add, if that's not enough, if I can just add another piece here of, since climate mobility is also deeply gendered and racialized, how do feminist, Indigenous, anti-racist, and decolonial perspectives help to expand this framework, challenging these questions of belonging, vulnerability, and justice, and how we define them in climate mobility policy and practice? So no small question there for you, but over to you.
Okay, thank you, Lauren, and thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this panel and this wonderful event. And I'm really happy to join my co-panelists here. And I just want to, before I answer or get into the questions, I just want to say, acknowledge, and my heart goes out at this moment to my friends and colleagues in the Caribbean region, where Hurricane Melissa has obviously caused a lot of damage and is still at this very moment causing damage in it's been through Haiti and Dominican Republic and Jamaica, as Cuba now, heading for the Bahamas, et cetera, Turks and Caicos. So this is the reason I got into this field and this thinking with the Caribbean, because I've been doing Caribbean work since the 1990s, first visited Haiti in 1997, and have continued to be involved in the region. And this kind of hurricane is exactly what we see being driven by climate change and the warm sea surface temperatures that enabled it to accelerate from a category 1 to a category 5 in 24 hours. So with that said, to get into your big questions, some of you might have heard the keynote address by Sarah Rosengartner, or keynote conversation right before this. And it's really interesting because she was also talking about how she defines climate mobility. And I kind of want to begin there by saying that there is a recognition in the field of people who are working on migration and who are working on climate change, that they needed to bring those together in terms of policies and institutional responses. And in some ways, the climate mobility justice approach emerged as a way to broaden the conversation. So it wasn't just about like one-way climate migration from point A to point B, and the sort of discourses around climate refugees. And climate mobility justice, and Andreas Neef has argued that it seeks to ensure that communities, households, and individuals who are affected by climate-associated displacement are treated with dignity and have their rights protected, whether they're displaced within their country, whether they're staying in place but have lost their livelihoods, or whether they're migrating to another place. And it's a combination of the challenges of kind of the legal frameworks that failed to recognize that, and then some of the humanitarian responses that themselves have been criticized in some ways. I want to say, so Sarah did a wonderful job of explaining climate mobility as a term rather than climate migration alone. But I often refer actually to climate mobilities, plural. And why is that? That's because I believe that a climate mobility justice approach has to recognize the wider and deeper coloniality of mobility regimes and the need for reparations and, as you said, repair. And that involves intersectional struggles for mobility justice that can address the legacies of colonialism, racial capitalism, all the present forms of unequal mobilities, unequal access, and extractivism, and the kind of private enclosure of land, of clean water, of access to food. And so that calls for a reparative justice approach. And that means really asking the harder questions, not being afraid to call out responsibility for the current situation. We must reduce the excessive consumption of fossil-fueled mobility by the groups who I call kinetic elites, and repair and prevent the injustices of global resource extraction that are based on what I call climate coloniality. That means not only that climate change has its roots in colonial plantation, agriculture, slavery, indigenous genocide, and displacement, but it also means that the ongoing extraction that's happening of ores, of metals, lithium, nickel, copper, bauxite, rare earths for the green energy transition are also continuing to affect indigenous peoples and people in the global south. So the climate mobility justice approach kind of seeks to connect the field of migration studies and the kind of issues around displacement with this broader set of questions, including energy use, fossil fuel consumption, transportation inequity, and all of the mobility injustices that occur at different scales. And, I'm speaking from a highly responsible country. I'm in Massachusetts in the United States, Nipmuc territory, I should say. And we were and are responsible for greenhouse gas emissions that are causing the kinds of hurricanes like Hurricane Melissa. So there's a deep moral case for our responsibility and climate reparations that are based on the long-term effects of these systems of coloniality and racial capitalism and extractivism that continue to impact and exclude Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, as well as women, excluding people from like human rights, from full citizenship, and almost what some call a kind of relegation to an almost non-human or infrahuman status. Some people call for an abolitionist climate justice. That's Malini Ranganathan and Eve Bratman. In an essay, they talked about dealing with the historical environmental racism and the intersectional drivers of precarity, precarious lives, social trauma, and displacement beyond those that are narrowly associated with climate. Instead, we have to embed climate debt in a longer historical time frame of, land return, social reparations, infrastructural repair, not just physical human infrastructure, but human and social infrastructure. So maybe I'll pause there and let others speak.
Thank you, Dr. Scheller. Yeah, lots to think about, a lot of systems thinking, right, going on. And I think that's very indicative of really what this framework is asking us to do, is to take this kind of present day moment or framing of climate mobility, this phenomena that's going on that we do see is definitely increasing in the trends. I mean, not the data by any means captures the whole story, but we've had an average for the last, since we've been keeping the data since 2008, of around around 25 million new displacements internally tied to climate impacts and disasters. And this last year, 2024, we had 45 million new displacements. So this is definitely increasing. But I think what you're pointing to also is that, and this is such a core tenet of this notion of climate mobility justice, is that, where does this phenomena come from? Because it's not just abstraction. And it's like, when did we start talking about this, and what gets included and what doesn't? And I think a really core piece in this framing too is, which I think you pointed to, is that it's not really just about climate change, right? It's also about human caused environmental change and some of the harm that comes from that. And I think there's just a never ending stream of really tragic examples within kind of colonial, racial, capitalist, expansive projects toward capital accumulation that have led to the destruction of the environment and have pushed people into experiences of dispossession and displacement. And I think that often is not part of the conversation that we're having in the mainstream discussions on climate mobility. So thank you for really putting the gears on for us to start thinking about some of these systems. I think that sets us up quite well for shifting into thinking about kind of this broader framework of how do we decolonize some of our understandings and knowledge and institutional responses. So Nida, I'll hand to you and ask, your work looks closely at how dominant knowledge systems and institutional frameworks often shape who's heard and who's silenced in climate mobility spaces. How do current approaches to research, funding, or capacity building risk reproducing colonial hierarchies of knowledge? And what would it mean to reimagine these processes as reciprocal, community-led, and grounded in sovereignty, memory, and place? Over to you.
Okay, hello everyone. I hope you can hear me all right. My voice is a little bit messed up because I'm sick, but really happy to be on the panel, especially, alongside our panelists. Obviously, I've admired the work that you guys do for a really long time, so this is really wonderful for me. Just to, I think, start off with answering the question, I think we have to start off with talking about what the colonial hierarchies of knowledge are, right? So I think the way that I approach it, it very much looks like Western colonial epistemology, or the way that we sort of know things and what we know or what is accepted as knowledge, is very much considered superior and the sort of only way to see things. This is something that cancels out the potential for other worlds, for other knowledges, for other epistemologies, and it echoes the sort of colonial totalizing rationale of like replacing societies with either a better version of themselves or a better society overall, right? Knowledge production is also deeply linked to power, right? So Western scientific knowledges and rationales and logics very much affected the colonial endeavor, including the curtailing of indigenous, colonized, and local mobilities, as well as the knowledges that actually sustained those environmental mobilities or responses to environmental degradation. It also now determines who sets the research agenda, what kinds of experiences and narratives are considered legitimate data or evidence, who gets to speak about climate impacts, and very importantly, who gets to dictate the history that we are creating right now as we speak. I think that this colonial knowledge hierarchy has a lot of features, but some of the features that very much pervade into current approaches to climate mobility include universalizing solutions, so universal or technical solutions to climate mobility, which very much try to impose this one-size-fits-all sort of solution onto communities, ignoring their complex local realities, histories, approaches, as well as Western technocratic, expert-led, and scientific approaches. I think what all these approaches have in common is that they prioritize Western epistemology and as well as certain types of data, evidence, and knowledge over others, right? I think that current mainstream research, funding, and capacity building projects and endeavors in climate mobility often reproduce these colonial hierarchies by privileging these features of colonial knowledge hierarchies. I think what happens here then is that these approaches prioritize evidence-based technocratic approaches that center quantitative, expert-led, externally validated data over stories, memories, experiences, and lived realities. This essentially delegitimizes alternative epistemologies and follows or sort of continues to impose that Western-led way of knowing. For instance, funders often require specific reporting formats, metrics, or impact assessments that very much extract and use community knowledge, but in these processes of exclusion, deny these communities any form of agency or shared authorship. Moreover, with academia, I think there's a very explicit gatekeeping of funds and research. I think funding flows and publishing standards are very much controlled by actors in the global north, as well as like what is actually considered legitimate research, who is cited, which projects or narratives are amplified, and which are ignored. Similarly, I think in the world of policymaking, policies are very much designed with little to no participation from the communities that are actually being affected, perpetuating a cycle where these affected communities are seen either as victims or security threats, rather than the architects of their own policies, using their own experiences and knowledges, right? Similarly, I think capacity building is very much framed in an increasingly technocratic manner, assuming that the communities impacted have sort of lack skills or knowledge about their experiences and about what solutions they could come through with. However, I think the most crucial sort of caveat here is that Western knowledge is not the holy grail. And I think that communities that are affected know that. They have their own alternative epistemologies, expertise, and self-determined responses that are often ignored or purposely sidelined. That kind of brings us to what it would mean to then reimagine these processes, right? I think just off the bat, it would be a process of decolonizing climate mobility knowledge. I think decolonizing is a big word that often gets thrown around, but I think here in this space, it would look very much like centering justice and non-Western epistemologies as leading guides for climate action, right? I think I want to bring in a little bit of praxis here. So I'm going to be borrowing the next section from the survey that we did recently at the Beyond Climate Collaborative, where we surveyed the perceptions, challenges, needs, and aspirations of emerging climate mobility leaders. I think a lot of what we found from people who are part of affected frontline communities or work very, very closely with them is, of course, the challenges that we've just discussed, but also solutions or aspirations of solutions for how we can reimagine these processes, right? So some of the things that came up very strongly were engaged participatory research with methodologies that actually allow for the co-designing of solutions, as well as the co-designing of self-determined responses. I think something else that came up quite a lot was community-led funding. So moving towards more direct, flexible, decentralized funding streams that actually invest in community-governed organizations and the sort of long-term accountable projects that reflect the long-term nature of climate impacts as well. I think another thing that really came up was the importance of respecting how the language, and ancestral knowledges of affected communities actually guide climate action. So I think in conclusion, I think the crucial point here is that integrating these knowledges, the crucial point here pushes for the integration of these knowledges, not just into Western systems of knowing, but as pluralistic systems and worlds in their own right, on equal footing, on reparative footing especially. And I think it means recognizing the sort of reparative justice obligations for present mobility that has been very much shaped by, climate coloniality, right, does not just include material loss or climate justice, but it also includes a sort of devastation of climate and environmental, indigenous, and otherwise knowledges. I think I really want to end by mentioning something that's inspired by a paper from Robbie Shilliam over at Queen Mary, University of London, When confronted by a knowledge that feels, these are questions that I often ask myself and also other people. When confronted by a knowledge that feels unfamiliar, can you still work within or with this? Can you at least acknowledge its explanatory adequacy without feeling that you've sacrificed your intellectual integrity? And can you acknowledge that the difficulty in this acknowledgement is not the fault of the misunderstood or humiliated knowledge, but of the burden of colonialism that hangs upon our frameworks? Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Nadam. Thank you, thank you. Yeah, I love the powerful ending. Thank you for bringing that into this conversation. I mean, I think there's always such, like, if we really zoom out, there's always such a contrast between, you know, like theorizing and researching and producing knowledge within these Western systems of what is, you know, this output of producing an academic paper in that case, or a policy paper or report, right? I mean, there's always the task of you know, how are we building bridges with, you know, explaining, I mean, and on the one hand, that system and that process itself, right? I mean, really confronting some of these systems and structures through which it's almost required in this kind of, you know, world in which we find ourselves, that we find channels to relay on the ground experiences to funders who have, you know, access to respond, to humanitarian actors, so on and so forth, right? And I think that that process has a lot of scope for kind of reproducing harm within it and marginalization within it. So how can we start to move, I think, beyond that? I think we have, we're really lucky to have Dr. Lily Yumaglova with us to maybe start to help us unpack that in practice a little bit here. So Dr. Yumaglova, through your formidable work at Preparing Our Home, you work closely with First Nations communities on Turtle Island to strengthen community-led resilience, combining intergenerational community needs with local and Indigenous knowledge and technical disaster risk reduction strategies. Much of the climate mobility discourse emphasizes movement, yet for many communities, staying is itself an act of resilience, care, or constraint at times. How can justice frameworks help us to better understand and support those who remain in place, whether by choice, attachment, or lack of alternatives? And how might community-led or Indigenous approaches reframe what it means to have a right to stay? Over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lauren. And just big kudos to you for putting this together and all the love and attention that you pour in this space. And so glad to hear that you have some help with Nita as well. And really honored to be here on the panel with people whose work I have been reading for years. So it's a great honor, Dr. Mimi Scheller, to be here today. I wanted to introduce myself to begin. And Lauren, I'll just respond a little bit for some of the things that were shared before proceeding to the question, but and also bring in Lauren's invitation to reflect on where you come from today. So maybe the Indigenous territories you're joining from or the place you're visiting. And I also really wanted to ask those in the room with us today, what does home mean to you? Because I think that is the biggest question we need to start with. And that's why our program is called Preparing Our Home, because that's where it all begins. Is this a place you love? Is this a place you feel safe? So if folks can just drop a line, when you think home, what comes to mind first? And you might not be home today. And I also just wanted to acknowledge the privilege that I'm joining from a safe place. I have food in my fridge. And as we know, many people don't have the luxuries today. And unfortunately, one of the panelists could not join today. So Hamuhagat, minimum is similarly in Big Shotman is Nakurigapagin. So I am Lily, I am a Bashkir woman. I come from the Ural Mountains, and currently I'm a settler on the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories on the land now known as Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And I wanted to begin with a language dimension. So in our language, in Bashkir language, when we say homelands, the word for it is Yerhu. And what those words mean is land, waters, connected. They're not separated. So the word for homelands in our language means land, waters. And the territory that I'm in on right now, the Musqueam territory in Halkomelem language, when people ask, there is no words for saying, I don't know. Instead, the alternative would be, this is not my knowledge to carry. So I just wanted to really kind of embed the different way of thinking about land, waters, and home, and how we describe and the knowledges that we carry when we bring to this place. I also wanted to push a little bit back on the technocratic and all of that discussion that was happening earlier. As a practitioner in the field, so I work in emergency management, and we worked through preparing our home. We worked with over 140 communities across Turtle Island with very different capacities, different hazards, different histories, of course, united by the kind of colonial history of displacement, dispossession, genocide, and things like that that were mentioned earlier, including really important framing that displacement, that as we kind of are talking about today, the climate piece of it is just a small piece, right, in the large, long arc of displacement that has been happening, whether due to infrastructure development projects or cities growing or the gender role displacements as well, right? So where women, if married to a settler, would lose their status, while if the indigenous man married to a white woman, she would gain status within the First Nation community. So a lot of complex dynamics that are happening, and I think it's really important to situate today's discussion in this long arc of injustice that has been happening. But on the technocratic dimension, one thing that we've noticed across the communities that we worked with, and we provide technical training, whether it's oil spill, fire response, you name it, right? It's very different for folks. But there is, before we can even go into the spaces of discussing justice and kind of talking about these things, I think it's really important to find, before we can talk about equity, we really need to start talking about equality, even in terms of the form of public safety services provided. So in Canada, just to provide a practical example and kind of bringing up evacuations here as well to push back a little bit that, we need to get out of this space. We actually first need to fix this space before we can get out of it and move forward. So in British Columbia, for example, right now, when a person is displaced, there is the government provides 72 hours of support, right? So if there is an event, a fast-moving fire or something, you will have supports in terms of clothing, shelter costs, and things like that for 72 hours. The research that was done by kind of ombudsperson and kind of looking at the longer experience with evacuation, average displacement in British Columbia is now around 21 to 27 days, right? So the current system, the way we manage short-term displacement, is in no reflective of the risk that people are experiencing, right? So that would be really important kind of to begin there. For a lot of communities, before you can kind of talk about the long-term justice, especially in this kind of enormous pressure within the mining to transition into green economy, right? One of the big things that needs to happen is really understanding the language of a current emergency management system, which is often called incident command system or incident management system. This is a very much hierarchical, top-down command and control space where other folks can come into your community. It's basically like a response bulldozer. They come in, they shove everything aside, and they say, this is how we run the show right there. The beautiful thing that's been happening through our program, and again, kind of challenges the narratives around gender and vulnerability, is the aunties in these communities that stand in front of this bulldozer and say, no, we know who needs help. We will do it in our way. And one of the powerful things that the youth through our program did, so when the incident commander is in the room, he wears a green vest. So showing that I'm the boss and make decisions. So the youth in our program made an anti-vest, which is also color green, but on her back, and I can share that image with Lauren, maybe it can be forwarded, is the salmon and the waters and the berries and the flowers and the canoe, to really symbolize that this is the ancestral strength that we stand on. So I think decolonizing these spaces actually can have very, very practical examples of how we move forward in this space of work, especially as practitioners or as scholars. And then, Lauren, I'll just touch on to keep brief on time. When it comes to immobility, again, within the continuum of displacement, so whether it's short-term evacuations, which unfortunately in Canada, First Nations communities are 18 times more likely to be evacuated due to any disaster, 33 times more likely to be evacuated due to fires, and fire fatalities are anywhere from 4 to 10 times higher than the Canadian average. So in that short-term space, we need to do things differently. Then we need to do differently in the space of recurring evacuations. So some communities are evacuated year after year. And some of them during evacuation say, no, we're not leaving, we're staying here. And that's where it's really important to remember UNDRIP, no forced removal, right? So the United Nations Declaration of Indigenous Peoples' Rights, no forced removal without prior informed consent, right? So what does that look like in the space of emergency management? And then obviously after recurring evacuations, there are spaces of planned relocation and displacement. Again, really important to situate them within displacement that happened under the Indian Act within the colonial history. And then what are some of the outcomes? One thing that I think, and that's where Jola Jabadi, a dear colleague of mine, talks about, we don't have good metrics of success for planned relocation. So we looked at some, as part one of the Preparing Our Home project, really looked at the long arc of displacement across 5 communities and literally across all of Canada, all the way from kind of the west to the east into the Mi'kmaq territories. And basically, we know that people are sometimes relocated from the hazard. So flood is not a hazard anymore, but they're relocated by the highway. So traffic incidents, deaths, they're located onto different contaminated sites from agriculture. They're relocated in a way that completely disrupts clan structures. And even in the processes that are sometimes nation-led. So this is not federal or provincial government saying. So we also need to acknowledge this complexity within communities in terms of power dynamics. And I think that's a really important point to keep in mind. Sorry, Lauren, you're on mute.
I was
Yeah.
muted. I was saying, thank you. Your work always blows me away. And actually, we're always very lucky to have you also at the International School on Climate Mobilities every year. And it's like, I don't know, it never gets old to hear about the insights that you have. Also, I think just so practically, I feel that we need also to be inviting practitioners such as yourself into at central to these conversations. I think also understanding how like context specificity and how enormously important this is in how we address disasters as they're unfolding in particular, and kind of the aftermath of this, and right, what happens next, I think, beyond the evacuation piece. So thank you for bringing some of your work to us today. Very grateful for that. We actually have time, which is the rarest thing on earth. You were also brief, so you're more than welcome to take time as well. I'm sure there are thoughts in your minds, and so I invite you to kind of share anything that's come up as we've gone through this first round. I want to turn back to you, Dr. Scheller, and start thinking a little bit about kind of this bigger picture question of, if we start to take seriously this idea that climate mobility is not just a crisis to be managed, but a call to reimagine responsibility, who, in your view, needs to be accountable? And what does ethical responsibility look like in research, policy, funding? I think practice is a really tough one in particular too. So I'll hand back over to you.
Yeah, and I want to pick up on some of the things that both Nita and Lily said, which were wonderful and so important. The first one, I think, as I'm an academic, I'm in a university, I do research. I'm currently part of the Caribbean Collaborative Action Network, which is a NOAA climate adaptation program team. There's these teams across the US organized by region. And we are one of the more recently formed of these, we're called CAP teams. We have tried to center, as Nita was talking about, engaged participatory research and co-designing solutions with community-based organizations. And so, I mean, I think in terms of like accountability and ethical responsibility, we could start with that. And first of all, we were in a moment where federal funding was pointing towards that as something fundable, which is interesting because that moment may be lost, that window may have shut, but it was there temporarily. And what we're trying to do is work with organizations who are doing their own self-organizing. And this relates to some of what Lily was talking about. So we're working in the US Caribbean, which is the Puerto Rican archipelago and the US Virgin Islands archipelago. And Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands experienced hurricanes Irma and Maria back in 2017, as well as various other kinds of ongoing environmental stressors, as well as economic and political non-sovereignty as territories of the United States that don't have the same rights as citizens, state-based citizens. And so they have developed their own responses to those emergency situations. And what's come out of that is a philosophy that is called autogestión, or like self-direction, self-management, community organized management, exactly like Lily was speaking about. And we actually have a new a postdoctoral fellow named Barbara Lopez Gonzalez, who has been working with one of the organizations called Casa Pueblo. And I think that's a really great example of a community that's well known for having organized itself. And they created shelters that, you know, prepare food and deliver it to people who are unable to leave their homes. They assist children and people with medical conditions. They installed a solar-powered microgrid for access to communication. They help create emergency planning. They also do cultural activities, murals, arts projects to take pride in the local culture. And then they link this kind of resilience hub to regional farming, to agroecology, sustainable local economies, and food justice. And Casa Pueblo are a well-known example of that, but it happens across Puerto Rico, where other communities have also what they have called rescued schools, which were abandoned public school buildings, and then they've taken them into their own possession and turned them into these kinds of community hubs. And a really important part of that is the pride in, you know, staying in the island and reclaiming a Boricua identity, as it's called, dating back to Borican, which is the Taino indigenous name of the islands, and to embrace their culture. Which some of you may have seen like explode onto the world stage with Bad Bunny's residency, but I won't go into that. But that's all part of rebuilding like what the social and human infrastructure, as we could call it, the social care and relations. And those relations go beyond people to include animals and plants and ecological relationships, right? And so I think it shows us some of the ethics of responsibility that people are creating in their own communities. And I'll add to that Maroons, which are the people who escaped from slavery centuries ago, formed their own communities, sometimes in combination with indigenous peoples. Well, Maroons are also reclaiming a kind of indigenous identity and transnational organizing, and have imagined these imaginaries of Black geographies, Maroon presence, and indigenous sovereignty, which express relations of mobility and dwelling that are achieved through coming together in what I sometimes call a commons, or practices of commoning. And those are taking responsibility for caring for the places where they live to stop the pollution and the ecocide and enclosure and extraction and labor exploitation by kind of drawing on traditions that model other ways of being in the world. So I think that's where we really see ethical responsibility in praxis. And I think that both Black and Indigenous critical theory and epistemic beliefs and systems of thought bring to light these many ways in which people can care for the world differently, and that's reemerging through different kinds of activism. And I think those of us who are in academia or who are in like climate, migration, humanitarian response spaces, we need to be listening to those communities more.
Thank you, Dr. Scheller. Yeah, lots to pick up on there, and I think Neda, that's you to expand a bit. I'm just thinking, in particular, Dr. Scheller mentioned kind of these social care relations, right, and kind of also relations of mobilities within that. And of course, I'm very familiar with your work, and I'm wondering if there's something that you want to add with respect to kind of some of the reframing or reorientation around relationality within mobilities and immobilities that we've seen, and kind of what, you know, how does this sit within kind of a justice-based approach to how we think about and talk about and work to address mobilities and immobilities, and I'm sure there's connections to be made too there with kind of whose knowledge counts in those processes, and whose value systems, I think, because I think when we talk about knowledge, we're not just talking about knowledge, or we shouldn't be. We should also be talking about wisdom and lived experience and value systems, not just, you know, the research papers that get written or don't get written, right? So handing back over to you with your thoughts on this, Neda.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. With the, I would say, yeah, I was sort of thinking about this as Dr. Scheller was speaking as well. I think that recently in my research, especially, I've been exploring quite a bit about just, I guess, different forms of relationality and also different forms of representation when it comes to the experience of climate immobilities. So something that I'm, for example, looking at is, so my research is mostly based in Sindh, Pakistan, and something that I'm looking at very closely is how that sort of evidence of climate impacts or climate mobilities is represented maybe not in research papers or even sort of like practitioner-based evidence, but more so in folk music is a really big one, as well as just general storytelling, right? And I think that that kind of stuff, I mean, of course, it's rooted in these practices of like community care and community resilience, right? Because a lot of the concept of folk music is sort of like, you know, singing through or healing through this kind of grief of climate loss, but also representing like hope or resilience towards a future where, like, towards a future of protection. And I think that sort of represents this very different form of relationality that comes through when we talk about climate mobility knowledge, where we're not looking at, you know, we're not looking at necessarily, or we're not at least exclusively looking at metrics, but we're also looking at very real lived experiences and the way that people relate to what's happening around them, and not just how we as researchers see what's happening to them from the outside. Yeah, I think that's what I have to say on that for now.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is a deeply I remember hearing, just to add an anecdote into here, hearing from a colleague a while back that she had asked her students for the last 15 years to do an exercise at the start of her, I think, intro to whatever it was, an environmental sciences course. But she had given this assignment every year at the start of the class that said, you know, I want you to write about an imagined, you know, disaster scenario tied to climatic environmental change. And I want you to write a paragraph, free writes about, you know, what that would be like, right? And 10, 15 years ago, almost every paragraph she got was, you know, some made up hypothetical scenario, right? Well, now they're all people's firsthand experience, right? And I think that, of course, as the impacts of climate change are intensifying, that's being felt, you know, whether those are the words that you use to describe what's happening or not. And I think with those experiences intensifying, there is, you know, always that connection of kind of loss and grief and emotion, right? It's a deeply emotional experience. I mean, I think even as Dr. Scheller, you know, mentioned, at the very start, my heart is with the people in the Caribbean right now, right? And that's something that we feel, because it's not data, it's not a fact, it's not a statistic, it's a very real phenomena of loss, and there is grief with that. And I think climate mobility poses, and immobility can pose such sensitivity as well too, because it's, nobody wants to leave against their will to leave, right? For any reason. And I think that brings me to a question for you, Dr. Yurmagalova, about memory and place and repair. Many climate affected communities speak not only of loss, but of memory and continuity and repair. How might centering memory and place transform how we understand adaptation or resilience building efforts? I'm ambushing you, but over to you.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful poetic question. And actually, as a program, we're working on a book to share some of the lived experience and stories of recovery. And there is a whole section of memory and loss and hope in the book that I think talks about some of these issues. So some of the communities had enormous fires, like incinerate their traditional territory. That land is not coming back for a while. So the intensity of the burn has burned down the seeds. The soil has become hydrophobic. So the water is just running through. Now we have floods coming in, and those forests stand without life for years, right? So, but that also means that generations of children will lose kind of future memories as well, not just the past, right? They won't form those kind of kind of space of wonder and attachment to those places. Some of our communities that we worked with have been displaced from their home for over 11 years. So children grew up in hotel rooms, drinking out of plastic bottles, unable to return to home. Again, you are not able to even form the kind of the attachment to the home that you come from. Unfortunately, we also heard about a lot of stories how elders get seriously unwell when they are evacuated or displaced for years, eating different foods, being away from the social support structure, kind of like you are dispossessed of love, right? When you are moved away, shoved into some environment you don't know, so much damage can happen. And I think it's really important for us not to think about Indigenous communities or any other group as this uniform block that experience displacement the same way. One of the categories that we found is experience really profound voices are Indigenous single moms who are fleeing domestic violence on reserves, for example. And on top of that, if she doesn't own a car and she has 4 children and one of them has a disability, the options for that mom are very, very limited, and the suffering is really great. So I think really understanding who and how are going through these experiences and then reducing the suffering over the long term. As I mentioned, across Canada, Indigenous communities are much more likely to be displaced for very prolonged period of times. The kind of the business approach from the federal agency, long-term displacement is after 60 business days, whatever that means. So kind of defining what supports kick in, because often they disappear after that. So that's really important. But engaging with the concept of memory, I think it's so personal. Like my people, Bashkir people, we are people of the horse. It's definitely climate mobilities or mobilities. It's an S at the end because it depends on your horse. Horse was our home, our transport, our food. So our traditional food is fermented mare's milk. Sounds gross, but it's delicious and it's also probiotic. So good for you. So and now I live here, and I'm a member of the Squamish Ocean Canoe family. This is actually Kohoth. The family's he is. The kind of the center, the anchor. Canoes have gender because they either come from cedar female tree or male tree. So this is Kohoth, and he has a partner, Hakili. And obviously for people here, the canoe is their home, right? Like that was what connected homes across the land and waters, kind of like from winter villages. They were kind of intrinsic mobility patterns. You moved with seasonal availability of food and hazards, right? So I feel like memory as a personal and kind of community collective construct is something that we do need to engage much more in this field and write about it more. So I look forward to hopefully sharing the book when it comes out, and we'll go from there. Thanks, Lauren.
So glad to hear it coming. Please keep us posted. Definitely keep us posted. Looking forward to reading. That's beautiful, beautiful work to capture. And I think also great example of exactly what Nita was referring to that we need more of actual, kind of outputs from the communities that you're working with themselves, right? And not such a degree of separation also to, right, to document their own experiences and needs. We don't have any questions in the chat, so I will invite audience members to please put your questions into the chat. I think we have a Q&A box in particular, so if you can pop them there, that would be great, and we'll open up for Q&A. While we're waiting to get a question, I do have one more, and I'm going to kind of come out of left field here because unfortunately Ben couldn't join us today, and Ben works on the policy side a bit more in his work in East Africa. And so I want to see if we can kind of bring some of the policy perspective in ourselves. Because of course, one of the things we're really talking about here is kind of shifting power by centering community needs and justice-based approaches into our understandings and solutions and so on and so forth. But what we haven't talked about as much is kind of zooming back out to that more structural, systemic kind of framework of state-centric kind of approaches that dominate responses to climate mobility, even though the causes and consequences transcend borders. So I'd like to kind of, I was going to ask Ben this question, but I think I'll bring it in for you, and if there's something else you'd like to speak to, you're most welcome to do that too. But I'm curious, we'll start with you, Dr. Scheller, if that's all right. From your perspective, how might we begin to imagine new forms of transnational responsibility and solidarity that are not led by states, but by cities, diaspora, regional networks that uphold the rights, dignity of climate-affected persons? But I think also what should we be pushing for with respect to states, because they are a part of these frameworks, right? And they are the holders of human rights obligations to bring that to the forefront. And there, is reason to point in their direction for these questions of historical responsibility and accountability, or the climate crisis, for exclusionary border regimes, restrictive border mobility regimes, and so on and so forth. So I'm just curious if we can kind of bring that in a bit and start to think about what role policy could actually play in these kind of cross-border forms of cooperation and justice, rather than constraining them within existing kind of migration and adaptation frameworks. So back over to you.
Yeah, I think my thoughts on this actually link to a sort of later question of yours about kind of what gives you hope and examples of solidarity and collaboration, because I think that's where we find some really interesting policy ideas emerging. And that is to say, especially here in the United States right now, there's incredible activism happening around supporting migrants who are threatened by deportation. And it's driving a kind of re-emerging discourse of like solidarity and collaboration across borders. And I mean, in so many cases, there are already existing kind of informal economies and politics of care, but also the things like you were talking about of memories and language and mobile sense of belonging that has always crossed borders. And families are spread across so-called national borders. We're moving and dwelling at different stages of our lives and in different like configurations of who's in a family, and some are moving, some are staying. That's always happened. And so we see this real solidarity emerging. And I link it to what Ananya Roy and Veronica Zablotsky refer to as counter cartographies of mobility. And they describe that as part of a broader repertoire of spatial practices that reinscribes sanctuary through alternative relationalities of solidarity. And I think that points us towards a different kind of policy space, a different kind of imagining of where change is happening and how. And so I think of things like grassroots groups that have created housing for migrants, movements like No One is Illegal and the No Border Assembly. These self-organizing groups that also, create collective gardens for food and self-created housing projects and cooperatives and self-organized healthcare and education and work. And all of that can stream into a kind of policy framework where, especially at the urban level, we would be able to have cities that could support this, what some imagine as a kind of communist, not communist, commoning urbanization, a communist urbanization that's like alternative forms of tenure, of land holding that's decommodified, of collective rights and communal regulation. So all of that, it kind of rejects like the logic of the refugee camp or the productive migrant or the temporary work permit, all of that stuff, or the humanitarian gesture of charity. And instead, it asserts the autonomy of migration and the dignity of self-determination by communities. And that's not like a future utopia. It's already happening. It's already here. So can policy help support that?
Dare I say that was beautiful, and I think I personally, I'm sure I'm not the only one on this call. I'm heading into COP in Berlin in a couple of weeks here, and that's just such a good reminder before such a frustrating policy landscape that does feel so technocratic and top down. And I just to add a quick anecdote here, last year in Baku, this was the first time that I had attended COP, and I was so woefully disappointed, not just by the policy negotiations, but I think by it just felt like we were all talking to ourselves. It felt like we were all the civil society, and this is not to discredit anyone's amazing work, but it felt like we all kind of already know each other in this climate mobility space, and we're familiar with each other's work, and we're all just kind of saying the same things. And, like we've all kind of, been reading each other's work and seeing it for a long time. And I realized while I was there that there were, that really, I'm somebody who thinks in terms of the energetic exhaustion or the give back, right? And for me, COP was just draining. It just took my energy. But I realized there were two places that I got energy back from it. And this was one from the youth activists who are often very tokenized within this space, who would sit on panels and just speak their truth about what they are living and what they are seeing, and be so unapologetic about it, because it's not about diplomacy for them. It's about their life and their community and their family and their friends, and really needing to see impact from a place of criticality, not just because they want results to put in their report, which I think does happen within the humanitarian context at times. And the other place was in the lobbies, where there were kind of just protests every day, if you will. People had badges to be there, very kind of crowd controlled, if you will, but just these make polluters pay banners, and this just this energy that was being brought, that I think just spoke so much louder than the outcomes of the policy negotiations. And I think that one of the hardest things in part to all of this work is the tension that exists with those things, and trying to find a way to narrow that gap. I think that's really what we're doing here. And shout out to those who get engaged in this policy advocacy work, because it's not easy. Because anyone who's ever written a policy brief knows that you have to be really careful, right? Like the language of human rights can be scratched in 2 seconds if you want to actually get the government to listen to you. Because I don't like when you talk about human rights. So it's that the daring, the courage that it takes, and the daring to speak the truth to power, really, to put it kind of bluntly there. But I think I still invite questions within the Q&A, because I still haven't received any. But I think I just want to invite Nina to pick up on anything we've discussed, and then that's Yuhagalova will do the same, because I think we have a flow here. So just handing over to you, Nina, with any thoughts that you want to share. We've got about 20 minutes left here, so we'll see if any questions come through, but over to you for your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, of course, I completely agree with everything that Dr. Scheller has said, and it was put like so beautifully. I think the only thing that I would sort of say is like, I think maybe outside of thinking about alternatives, but more just thinking about the policy that does already exist. I think something that I've been really interested in exploring is the concept of migration as decolonization by Professor Chume. I think that's something that has been definitely discussed, but as far as my knowledge goes, I think maybe not extended as much as I feel like it could have been, or it could be still very much has the potential. I think it's a very interesting concept to sort of add to the current policy systems that we have, right? Because there's one thing to sort of be like, of course, the aim, at least my aim, is like no, no borders. But I think until we get there, it's interesting to think about what kind of alternatives are the ways that you could deepen the policy systems we currently have to make work for populations that have been ignored, right? So I think the concept of migration as decolonization is really interesting because it kind of puts forward this like reparative movement that could be integrated into the current legal and policy systems of sort of historical responsibility in the climate migration or climate mobility world that we already have. Of course, it feels a little bit more radical than what we have currently, but I think it's still easily enough integrated, or at least you would hope it would be. And I think the concept basically lays out the fact that citizens of the sort of third world automatically have citizenship to first world nations because of their historical responsibility of exploitation and extractivism from the third world in order to build what they are currently. Therefore, the sort of movement of citizens from the third world to the first world then becomes a matter of reparative movement. So yeah, that's sort of what I was thinking while we were talking about this.
Thank you, Nada. Yeah, I think I certainly think that restrictive border movement is not arbitrary, and there, of course, is a lot to be said about what policy frameworks or protection frameworks also can do to open up space for people to really live in dignity as they navigate life on a warming planet. I think in particular too. Dr. Yumakulova, I'll hand back over to you.
I just wanted to connect a couple of themes on policy and hope. So one of the things that Preparing Our Home program through youth advocacy, like those specific voices, Lauren, you mentioned, what we managed to achieve within the kind of federal policy of Build Back Better after disasters is creating child-friendly spaces. So for example, if the community is being evacuated for a prolonged time, normally you're shoved into these hotels. What we've seen, domestic violence goes up, substance use, like all kinds of social issues add up. So under this child-friendly policy, instead of shoving youth into these unsafe spaces, one thing that can be done, for example, they can be sent to a volleyball tournament instead, or a basketball tournament. So those kind of small practical things where we change the narrative, flip it, like, no, we're not going to send them there. We're going to send them somewhere where they will feel like they belong and they're doing something. So I think that's very important. And on the point of the Q&A, there was a question in Q&A. It's like such an important question. Like, what do we even search for? Like when we enter stuff in the internet, what are we even looking for? And I just wanted to say that I think one big problem we all have is loneliness. And me as a displaced person, I can't go back home because it's unsafe. Rebuilding your life in a new space can be very difficult, right? Finding your home, finding your people. And in part, Preparing Our Home was entirely selfish enterprise where I just wanted to find folks who kind of maybe felt like me. So I think I just invite everyone in this circle today, and it's a very quiet audience at the end of the long day and listening to folks, but think about it. Do you feel lonely ever? I'm sure you do. And what are you doing about it? And sometimes the best thing to do about it is really help others. And if we can help in this communist approach, or help people who are fleeing whatever unsafe environments. I think that would bring that dignity to us ourselves, to feel like I'm actually doing something about it, instead of this absolutely strange scenario where this system works for very, very few folks, right? So when do we stand up and say, no, not for me, I'm going to do things differently? So thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and thank you for picking up on the question already too. I think I'll hand it to did you just answer it, Dr. Scheller? I see you've put
Yeah,
something
sorry,
there.
I put the article that concept comes from, which I should have mentioned, which is it's by someone named Sevilla Buitrago, and it's a preprint is available as a PDF at that link.
Great, amazing. You're gonna have us all confused between communism and communism. I love that. That's a takeaway from today's event for sure. Okay, so just with the last few minutes, and you are a quiet audience. Maybe it is the end of a long day. So maybe just with the last few minutes, I'd like to ask kind of a reflective question, that I think picks up on kind of a lot of what we've been talking. So maybe I'll start, Dr. Scheller, with you, if that's all right. If we imagine climate mobility justice not merely as a theoretical framework or idealistic policy outcome, but as a way of being in relation, what values, relationships, or practices do we need to nurture to make that possible, in your view?
So I've been trying to work on and work with the concept of mobile commons or mobile commoning. And it actually relates a little bit to the canoe that Lily was speaking about, like that there's not a dualistic, we are either mobile or we are dwelling somewhere. In so many cultures, there's a kind of mobile dwelling, a dwelling in motion, and they're not separated in that way that comes about through practices of capitalist land ownership, basically, that carves things up into little private spaces. So for me, like an everyday politics around practices of commoning mobilities is about trying to have more inclusive, just, sustainable, and caring practices of shared mobilities and immobilities, or movement and dwelling, in which the sort of reproduction of life and of being in common with each other is neither private, like capitalist ownership and heteropatriarchal families, nor is it public, like state-owned and public state policy, but it's a kind of mobile third space. And I sometimes relate it to Fred Moten and Stefano Harney's idea of the undercommons, which also like mobilizes an idea of commoning as a kind of subaltern way of moving through the world. They describe it as a kind of relational counterposition and an epistemic perspective from below. So they refer to life stolen by the Enlightenment and then stolen back, where the commons can be a refuge and the refuge gives commons. So for me, that idea kind of repositions the idea of the refugee and turns it into an active practice of fugitive commoning. And that, it makes us think differently about what does it mean to seek refuge, to have refuge, to be a refugee. Mobile commoning kind of asks that we all move over the earth, the land, the waters more with more care, with more concern for others, both like human others and more than human others. And we accompany each other across difference. And I also think of the work of I believe he's a Canadian Indigenous scholar, Craig Fortier, who argues that commoning must also be a practice of unsettling and decolonizing the commons, so that a decolonization of mobile commoning is about a kind of relationality that emphasizes interdependence between humans, animals, the natural world, ancestors, the cosmos. Those are the kinds of maybe idealistic, practices I think about as like the outcome I would hope for and want to make possible.
Beautiful. Thank you, Dr. Scheller. Nida, same question. I can repeat it if you want me to.
It's
Let
okay.
me put it in the chat.
Thank you. Yeah, I think actually I'd really like to go off of what Dr. Scheller just said. Firstly, I love the life stolen from the Enlightenment and then stolen back. That's a great line. I also think that, yeah, this is something that I've been slightly thinking about recently, just looking over your question again, which is just that I think a lot of what climate, maybe like earlier climate migration literature, for example, or very like dominant views of climate migration kind of focus on is this thing of like solving it, right, or like fixing it, rather than seeing it as this movement as a sort of constant presence of life which has always been around and will always continue to be around, right? And I think one of the ways to think about this a bit more relationally, or as a way of being in relation, is of course very related to what Dr. Scheller just discussed actually, but I think in a slightly separate formatting maybe, which is just how we actually envision it in the future. So kind of coming out of action a little bit, going more into knowledge or envisioning, but how we envision the future not as something in not as a space in which climate mobility will eventually be solved or not exist, but as a space in which we can continue to prepare for it and continue to go through those cycles of not necessarily harm, but of movement, and how that can be a sort of like hopeful utopia that doesn't really align with the very typical definition of a utopia in which nothing ever goes wrong. So I guess it's sort of like resilience actually that is based in this concept of like commoning or like mobile dwelling.
Thank you. Dr. Yumaglova, over to you.
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts that come to mind to bring in the canoe metaphor again. Thank you, Mimi, for picking that up. One thing I learned from the Squamish culture is that you always leave a seat for the ancestor in the canoe. So one seat is not taken by the person that's currently living. And I think we really need to find spaces to honor that everywhere we go. So that's one thing that Preparing Our Home has done in a beautiful way, creating intergenerational spaces. So I think when we think about those spaces of commoning, how do we also make them welcoming for multiple generations, right? I think that would be a really important one. The other one, I just wanted to finish with a kind of more personal story. Last year, we were actually evacuated for several weeks from my home community, which is in the mountains in British Columbia, a tiny village of 500 people. It was an insane inferno. Like the skies were black, everything around was burning. Like ppm was around 750. You literally, like, there were dead insects falling off the sky. And out of 500 people, 90 decided to stay. So essentially, your home becomes a prison. You're not allowed to leave your home. You can only stay in your home. The gate goes up. You have to sign off your life to the police. So, but they were allowed to stay and defend if they could do it and things like that. But the fire was literally on all sides. And we live by the lake. But what happened after the fire has passed is the ecology, like the animals in the fall, normally at this point, there would be a lot of bears passing through, all eating my apples and pears and everything I was going to harvest and store. This year, there were no bears. And I think that's one thing. Do not forget about the bear, like the non-human kinship, all these systems that sustain us, right? So the birds left because everything around the village is kind of burnt out. Many of the birds went somewhere, but I'm afraid bears probably just burnt down. They couldn't outrun. It was a completely unusual, really fast-moving kind of high drought, high intensity fire. So I think when we talk about this mobility and things, let's remember the non-human kinship that sustain the ecosystems on which we depend on. And let's not forget about the bear.
Thank you for that. And yeah, sorry for the evacuation. I mean, the personal experiences with the destruction as well too, from the Pacific Northwest, which is the northwest corner of the United States, for those aren't familiar. And yeah, the wildfire destruction is really maybe more my personal also trigger and kind of experience also with climate change impact. So thank you for sharing also with this. I think I'll close us out by, if I may, actually answer my own question here, because of course I've been thinking as you've all been speaking and exchanging so many captivating and important ideas here. I think the word that really comes to me is values in the question that I've asked, and the two things that come to mind are really the framework of truth and reconciliation when thinking about climate mobility justice. Because I think that for us to work toward justice, we have to tell the truth about injustice. And we have to tell the truth about how we got to where we are, understanding the injustices that exist within disproportionate vulnerabilities and how that shapes experiences, outcomes, etc., for people who are forced to move or are immobile, not by choice, etc., on a warming planet. So I think starting with telling that truth and honoring that truth, and when Paul at Western Michigan University decided to host this event, he had reached out to me, and the first thing I said to him was, "Do you have a panel on justice?" Right, and he said, "Nope, your panel would be the first." And I said, "Well, then we have to do this panel, because I think we cannot keep obfuscating injustice within our mainstream conversations of climate mobility. And I want to see more of this. And I'm grateful to all three of you for the work that you're doing to advance this, of course, because I think, again, it really starts with being honest about kind of where we are and how we got here, so that we can then have at least a semblance of a chance at trying to reconcile that and trying to repair that and trying to heal also, because there is pain and there is grief associated with all of these structural kind of overlapping systems of violence and marginalization and oppression and restrictive kind of exclusionary regimes that predetermine that vulnerability and also the experiences and kind of outcomes for it for different groups of people. So that's the first one. And I think the second is love. And I think that I was scared to say this word when I was thinking about this question, because you're not supposed to talk about love on a panel. But what if we did? What if we did? What type of world would we live in if we did? And I think this is where I always like to bring it home and think, all of this healing work, because it really is healing work. I think it does have to start with us, and it may sound trivial, but I think it does. And I think that requires all of us to show up and not only reflect on our positionalities in relation to the spaces that we occupy when we think about and address these challenges, if you will, this intersection, but also how we show up in our everyday lives, right? We can't show up in these workspaces and advocate for people to self-determine their own futures, etc., to show more compassion and care and be more ethical in the world and not do it ourselves. I think we maybe our greatest work is not the papers that we write, but is more how we show up in the world in relation to this. I will conclude with that, but I just want to say a big thank you again to our organizers for making this event possible, but also, of course, to Dr. Michelle for being here, Nida Sarah for being here, and Dr. Lily Yumagalova. Always a pleasure. Thank you for your inspiration, your thoughts, your expertise, and for the incredible work that you do. And for those who have not read the work of these powerful panelists today, please go on Google Scholar. There is a never-ending list of really mind-altering pieces of work to read. So thank you for all that you guys do and for being with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lauren.
Great job.
Thank you for organizing this. Thank you for the great questions and leading the discussion.
Yeah, thank you for joining me.